Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
80-bit Pod Smash,
where gaming goes to grab a beer.
I always spill a little bit on me when I do that.
Ooh.
We are your hosts, Penguin and Termite. I am Penguin.
I am Termite.
And we are a weekly video game podcast smashing ideas you care about with video games. Tonight we are continuing our Soul in the Console series, where we have been going through the different generations of specific manufacturers' consoles, and we did all of Sega's consoles, and we are now working our way through Microsoft's consoles. We did Xbox a few months ago, and now we are doing the Xbox 360, so the 7th generation representative from Microsoft's side of the pond. And we'll be talking about that tonight and going through the history and the hardware and the games and the impact. And we'll be going through all of that, but we are where gaming goes to grab a beer, so we like to start by talking about what beers we are drinking tonight.
And as I continue to try new things, I found a new beer I'd never had before called Windbreaker from the Mast Landing Brewing Co. in... Where are they? They are in Westbrook, Maine, and their logo is an awesome ship, which I was inspired to buy it because I love Sea of Thieves, and that's how nerdy I am. So seeing this, it's a double dry hopped India Pale Ale, so it is right up my alley. It's an IPA with all the hops in the face, and 6.5% ABV. It does not have a cheeky can thing to read, so all I can do is describe it as a double dry hopped IPA, because that's exactly what it is. It is
Nice.
It is a solid, good quality IPA. It has all of the flavor notes a regular IPA would have from all the hops, and it is delicious. Cloudy, but delicious.
Nice. Yeah, I meant to go out and get new beer, but I was really busy with work near the end of last week and today, and just really didn't get a chance to get out over the weekend. And when I was out, I wasn't thinking about beer. So, I'm just drinking the last of my Rockville Reds. I won't bother explaining it. If you have not heard me talk about this beer over the last 3 episodes, then I would encourage you to go check out the other episodes. But it's a very good Irish red ale, is what I'll say this time.
Still working on those red ales.
This is the last one, so I have no excuse. I gotta go get beer before next Monday. So
I think last week on the podcast I talked about how I went to Aslan Brewing and I picked up a bunch of different beers, 4 different ones. I actually kept one can from each of the 4-packs in the fridge for the podcast. So I have it's different beer, but all from that one trip. So I'm kind of borrowing ideas from you that, you go buy one pack and it lasts you how many weeks.
Yeah.
I did that with 4 different 4-packs.
So
essentially doing the
variety.
same thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, smart.
No.
That's smart. I am not smart, nor am I particularly with it.
Come on now.
I'm ADHD. I have an excuse now.
Yep, you are officially diagnosed.
Yep. So I wanted to fill this spot before we move on to our segments, and I wanted to talk about chicken sandwiches.
Yes, let's do that.
If you don't
Let's
mind.
go all about it. I just threw my pen on the
topic.
table. I am ready to go. I am in.
So here's why I wanted to bring it up. So McDonald's launched their chicken sandwich, and
I told you about my experience, right?
You did, yeah.
Okay,
well, and that's why I wanted to talk
okay.
about it. So I wanted to bring up your experience because McDonald's launched their new chicken sandwich, and it's supposed to be a competitor to the Popeyes Chick-fil-A fare. And I had it the day it launched, and I was actually kind of impressed. I was like, this is a solid competitor. It's not as good as Popeyes, but it's better than most of the stuff that McDonald's offers in general. That said, I love McDonald's for what they are, which is just really cheap, gross food. Sometimes you want that. My wife always says sometimes you want a chemical patty, but this was surprisingly good for the home of the chemical patty. Then I had it tonight, and I was less impressed, and I don't know what it was. Maybe I think the chicken felt less crunchy, when you want a chicken sandwich, at least when you want a Popeyes chicken sandwich. What I love about it is that thick breading, and I felt like that was the case with the first one I had, but the one I had tonight was kind of thinly breaded, and there was a weird taste to it. Something was up with the way it tasted, and I definitely did not care for it. I cared for Popeyes and I cared for the first time I had it. So it reminded me of your experience with the McDonald's chicken sandwich, and you basically saying that you wanted to throw up and get something else.
No, well, so I am generally generally extremely forgiving when it comes to food. It takes a lot to disappoint me with food. I love food, and I will eat anything. There's nothing that I'm like, turn my nose up, that's in the realm of normal food. I'm not going to go eat an octopus. Like, that's weird.
Are you kidding me? You've never had caviar before?
I would try it, but no, I have not.
Oh, it's so good, dude. Like fried caviar. It's very good. Sorry. So carrying on. No, I'm sorry. I was meant calamari, not caviar. I'm an idiot. Calamari.
Yeah.
It's octopus, calamari. Dude, or it's like squid. It's one of those stuff.
I'm talking like some people eat live octopus. It's a thing.
Yeah,
it's still squirming around and it sucks.
It likes inks out. Don't do that. Octopuses are really smart. Don't eat octopuses. They're really intelligent animals. You wouldn't eat a puppy, and puppies you wouldn't eat it because it's smart. So don't eat a freaking octopus.
But like if I was in an East Asian country that sold like dog on the street markets, I would probably try it.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Like I would eat that
too. Yeah.
So within the normal realms, and that's not really culturally normal for us, I would eat horse, even though that's definitely not cultural for us. I would not go out and get it. Like I'm not going to go seek these things. But if it was presented to me, it was already done. The deed was done. I would try it just for the sake of trying something new. Anyway, I was just trying to paint a picture of like how not picky I am.
Yeah.
And so I'm really hungry. I'm driving for work. It's 4 + 5 hours away, and I'm really hungry. I want something quick because I'm going straight to work. I'm not going to the hotel. This is not a travel day. I am leaving. I'm on the clock. I'm going straight to a lab 4 hours away or whatever it was. So I get a notification on my phone that McDonald's came out with a new spicy crispy sandwich. And I'm like, yes, I am in. I'm excited. This is going to be good. I love the sandwich wars. Everyone wins because capitalism. And capitalism drives quality in the market and drives down prices. And this is going to be the best thing yet. And so I pop in through the drive-thru at McDonald's and I pull into the parking lot spot to eat. So I'm not eating and driving. And I eat this thing and I was so disappointed. It had nothing that I was expecting when it comes to how good a chicken sandwich should be, which right now Popeyes is the king. Popeyes has everything I want in the chicken sandwich wars. And this had nothing. It didn't have the crisp. It didn't have the taste, and it didn't have the quality. There's a McDonald's oil that's on all of their food, whether it's a McChicken, a McDouble, a Quarter Pounder, a Big Mac, or their French fries, or their nuggets. It doesn't matter what you get from McDonald's outside of like ice cream. There's this McDonald's grease or oil taste. And that's what this chicken sandwich just overwhelmed. That I got this food from McDonald's. Like if I was doing a blind taste test, no doubt this is McDonald's. And that overwhelmed the taste of the chicken sandwich with no quality. It was garbage. And I was so disappointed that I almost stopped somewhere else to get a second lunch just to have something to satisfy some taste buds. Because at that point, I'm not hungry. I ate a whole chicken sandwich. I don't need to eat. And I didn't stop to get any more food. I was just so disappointed. Mm-hmm. And I'd never get disappointed about food. But that's my experience with the McDonald's chicken sandwich. Yep. And it's just bad. So on the way home, when you were live streaming Outriders, I popped into Wendy's. And this was really, really bad because I had skipped lunch that day. And so I hadn't eaten in like 13 hours. And I was really hungry. And so I pulled into Wendy's, drive-through, parking lot, same situation. But I got their chicken sandwich, which I hadn't had in a while. And they have a spicy chicken sandwich that's not that new jalapeno popper one. I didn't get that. I wanted a regular spicy chicken sandwich. And it was amazing.
Yeah.
Like second place to Popeyes.
I don't consider Wendy's chicken sandwich like a competitor to Popeyes because they're not like going for the same thing. And I liked Wendy's chicken sandwiches before. It was cool to like chicken sandwiches. I liked Wendy's. I had been eating Wendy's all throughout college, and I would frequently get their like Asiago chicken sandwich, and I always thought that was pretty good. Mm-hmm. But they're definitely not like their patties are definitely not the same quality as even the McDonald's patties, or at least barring the one I had tonight. I didn't love the one I had tonight, but the previous one I had, I was like, okay, this is definitely a step up with the chicken quality. And I would argue that the first one I had was better than anything I've had from chicken from Wendy's. But to me, I agree. Like for me, the when it comes to the actual sandwich, I still think Popeyes is king. But in regards to the total Popeyes experience, like I hate Popeyes. I've never really had like what I would consider good service at Popeyes. And I do not care for any of their sides. So for me, when it comes to an entire chicken sandwich experience, Chick-fil-A is still when you encapsulate the entire experience, for me, it's still Chick-fil-A.
Huh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think their chicken sandwiches are overrated, but the service is unparalleled. Yeah, like there's no fast food restaurant on the planet that has customer service like Chick-fil-A. Like they've nailed that for sure.
And the waffle fries, and their mac and cheese is really good. Yeah, they just have the whole kit and caboodle in that case. So the one
I haven't had.
I was gonna say I'm really intrigued by Burger King's got one. I don't typically love Burger King, but I'm willing to try a chicken sandwich. And the one I'm really intrigued by is KFC has a new sandwich called the Colonel, and I've read reviews that say it's not as good as Popeyes, but it's the closest anyone else has gotten to date in regards. I
think what we need to do is a chicken sandwich episode of the podcast.
You're not the only person who has suggested getting all the chicken sandwiches.
It's a spin. I know. Gotcha. It's not just get all the chicken sandwiches lined up. Let's pick a game that goes with each chicken sandwich.
So game pairing? The game. Chicken sandwich game pairing?
Yes, chicken sandwich game pairing. Mm-hmm. That's what we need to do. You heard it here first, folks.
That's it, yeah. My instinct right now in regards to like who does the best chicken sandwiches are places. It seems like the pattern is the places that are already doing chicken. Like Popeyes was a chicken shop, and then they released a chicken sandwich. Chick-fil-A has always been chicken, obviously, and now if KFC is properly competing, it's like, okay, yeah, it makes sense because they do chicken, like that's their thing. So like McDonald's, they don't do chicken, they don't do just chicken, I should say. Burger King, it's in the name, it's not Chicken King. So my instinct is that the best sandwiches are going to come out of the places that are actually already doing chicken. But all right, cool. That's enough of the chicken sandwich wars. We both like chicken sandwiches. And you may describe them as our favorite thing, but
doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Favorite things. Something cool that you're digging. Something as deep and meaningful as an experience you've had with a loved one, or as shallow and meaningful to you as a good chicken sandwich.
Exactly. And we hope that we are sharing these with you in hopes that you're inspired to go out and find your next favorite thing. So I will start. My favorite thing is... We had talked on our news show recently about the Elden Ring leak trailer, and the trailer itself isn't necessarily my favorite thing, though it is very exciting. My favorite thing that has offered me just a ridiculous amount of entertainment for as inane and stupid as it is. The Elden Ring subreddit right now has just been so funny. Like the memes and the inside jokes and everything coming out of the Elden Ring subreddit as they have, just had absolutely no news and no hope for so long, and then to suddenly get a glimmer of hope and to just see like the subreddit blow up with all these ridiculous, hilarious memes has just, I don't know, been a bright spot in an otherwise fairly stressful and dismal week for me. So yeah, I've been greatly enjoying all of the memes coming out of there, and I highly suggest anyone who has a passing interest in the Souls games, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or any of the Souls games, to go to this Elden Ring subreddit, because it's pretty fun. It's straight fire right now. It's great.
My favorite thing is I wanted to find, and I think I've talked about it on the podcast before, the original writers of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic book from the 80s. They had a fallout back in like the 90s, and they stopped writing things together, and they kind of went on their ways. But Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles has continued on in perpetuity through multiple facets of our culture. But the original writers had gotten back together, and they started a new comic book series called The Last Ronin. With that, the second issue came out in February. I think I talked about the first issue back in December. So that comic book is amazing and could be my favorite thing. And it kind of is wrapped up in this bigger story. So in wanting and knowing that this book had come out, I wanted to go to a local comic book store, not trying to buy things from big boxes or online stores, big ones. I wanted to support the local comic stores. So I Google, I don't really know the comic book store landscape in our area in Fredericksburg. So what's out there? And so I Googled, there's a comic book store really close to Reclaim Arcade over next to Gold's Gym off Route 3, close to 95. And so I was like, okay, this place is called Gateway Comics and Toys. My wife had the wonderful suggestion of me bringing my 5-year-old with me and saying, why don't you got a comic book for him too? I was like, yes, this is awesome. Let's go. Daddy and my son, let's go to a comic book store together and look at nerd stuff. So I walk into this store, and it's amazing. There's all this nerd memorabilia stuff, small little sections of retro toys, and then all the pop, what do they call those, Funko Pops, figures, and a bunch of figurines, and of course comic books everywhere. But it's probably the size of just the hallway in my basement. It's not super, super big. And so I asked the lady for The Last Ronin. Of course, she has it. But I'm also looking at the shelf of some of their retro comics, and I found, and this is what my actual favorite thing is, I found X-Men Onslaught, the complete epic. If you don't know what Onslaught is, or what I'm even talking about, this is the thing that if Fox relinquished the rights to, I know, right? If Fox relinquished the rights to their X-Men, Fantastic Four, Deadpool, etc., to the MCU proper over Disney,
you realize they've been bought. It's happening. All of that's happening.
But like, we haven't seen any fruit of that yet.
Okay, yeah. I understood.
So if I could talk to Kevin Feige, is that how you pronounce his name?
Feige. I think it's
Feige. I would pull him aside and be like, dude, this is your next MCU. This is the next 40 movies. Okay, it's called Onslaught, and I'm going to read the little synopsis on the back because it's awesome. If you're interested in Marvel Comics and Marvel stuff at all, this is awesome. The saga that literally remade the Marvel Universe of the 90s is collected in chronological order across 4 volumes. The psionic force of nature, known only as Onslaught, sprang forth from the fractured psyche of mutant mentor Charles Xavier and the genetic terrorist called Magneto. Powered by his progenitor's rage, Onslaught laid siege to humanity, touching off the cataclysmic conflict destined to deprive a world of its most revered icons. And just this one volume, of course there's 4, so it's 1/3 of the whole set, has X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, Fantastic Four, Avengers, Cable, and Incredible Hulk comics rolled into one. So like this story arc goes through those different comic book series, and this is just one of them. So the fact that it touches Avengers, that's Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, like this spans the Marvel universe, and it is game changing. And I really, really wish, I haven't finished it. I'm like 1/3 of the way through just volume 1. It's a lot, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I really, really hope that's my favorite thing. That's what I want. Go check out Onslaught. Yeah, I'm in.
And you have it, and you're going to read it.
1/3 of it so far. So and they're not cheap because they're old. So this one was $30 for one book.
That's the single reason why like I didn't get it. I occasionally would read and borrow and thought like some of the comics and collections that like my friends would let me borrow. But the biggest reason I never really got into comics myself, hardcore, I loved comics, but I would always read them so fast. And then I'd have to get the next one, and they're so expensive. So even when you're getting them like brand new and stuff like that, like it wasn't expensive. You think gaming is an expensive hobby? Like comics are an expensive hobby.
If you look at the time to money ratio, it's really bad for comics.
Yeah,
so like even The Last Ronin, which was one comic brand new, was $8. And like I read that in 15 minutes.
Yep.
And like if I spend $8 on Assassin's Creed Origins, like that's good 112 hours, 120 hours of content versus 8 minutes or 15 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you really do end up on the bad side of that equation when you buy comic books.
Yep, for sure. But for people who do and love that, like more power to you. It's an incredible hobby. It's really awesome. Highest respect. Comic books have been influential, incredibly, just massively influential to all of the media that I consume these days. So I'm like a grandbaby to the comic nerds.
And all of that was kind of inspired by WandaVision anyway. My impulse buy for this X-Men comic, because like everyone's going into these deep, I'm not going to talk about WandaVision, that's a whole thing. But the stuff that was showed off, the references to other movies, the things that are being woven together, like people just know this because they've read the comics. And like I've never been one of those persons. I've never been someone who read the comics and can see, oh, that's Nick Fury sitting in this spot. Obviously that means, XYZ. I don't know that because I don't know the comics. And so I'm like looking at this Onslaught thing. I'm like, this is so cool. There's so much stuff in here that I want to, like, I've never seen in the movie theaters that I want to jump into and like learn. So it kind of inspired me to pick up a comic book series like Onslaught so I could get into it. What did
Sam get?
He picked out a Sonic the Hedgehog comic, which I didn't realize was a comic book series.
Oh yeah, and there's comics for everything nerdy out there, pretty much.
Yeah, and so he loves it, and I'm trying to teach him like a little. This isn't just a magazine you would get in the mail. It's kind of a little bit nicer than a magazine, even though it's not as it's a little bit more expensive. It's kind of nice, and it's part of a bigger series. It's a little bit bigger of a deal than like a tabloid that you would just read through and throw away. And so it was a good chance to like talk about that too. I could go on forever because there's a second comic book store that owns it's still Gateway, but they have a second store that's ridiculously big, like Costco size big, and no, probably not that big, but it's huge, and it's around the corner in the same shopping center, and they had a slew of vintage toys, like slew. Like I don't know, it's so much. Power Rangers, Star Wars, Transformers, Lord of the Rings, Voltron, Gundam. I mean, you name it. They had all of the toys from the 80s and 90s, some brand new, some traded in, wrestling toys from like WWE and F. And my son went nuts. He wanted to buy all of it. And I was like, dude, this is not a toy you would just go to Walmart and get. Like this is something that
it's a collector.
It's like this tiny Lego Sebulba podcast or pod racer from episode 1 was $120. When it was new, it was probably $40. So like this is something that came out when episode 1 did. Anyway, that was my favorite thing. It's awesome.
Nice.
I love this sword. I will go back for sure.
Cool. I always love going to comic book stores. It's fun to kind of like be around your people, or be around just the stuff that is sort of inspirational. So the only problem is I would always go to like Barnes and Noble and like pick up books I wanted to. My idea of looking at books would be like reading through the first couple chapters. But when I would do that in comic book stores, the proprietors would be like, okay, buddy, you read like 5 pages in, you got to pay for that thing eventually. That's fair. But that's my instincts. I want to grab it off the shelf and start reading it. And they don't like that all the time. So,
Yep.
All right, cool. So that is favorite things, which leads us to our next segment, which is DLC, stands for downloadable content, and it's a fun discussion you wouldn't normally have about video games, and it's meant to, sometimes it's connected to our main topic. We don't really have like a tradition with our Soul in the Consoles. Sometimes for our, like we have trivia for some of our Everything franchise series, and we've got other stuff for some of our other series, but we don't really have something, so it's always fun to be creative. This one's not necessarily related to Xbox 360. This is instead a conversation that was inspired by the Escapist magazine. They have one of my favorite video game reviewers. His name is Yahtzee, or he goes by Yahtzee. His name is Ben Crawshaw, I think, and he does some very overly critical, I would say, reviews, but I love him. I love his like style and his snark and sarcasm. But he has another show that he does with another writer from The Escapist, and it's called Slightly Civil War, and they pick a topic and then debate that topic, each picking different sides. But in this case, they did an episode where they picked the same side but had different answers to the question problem. And the question problem that they proposed was, what should we rename the Souls-like genre to? And I thought that was a really interesting discussion, so I thought it would make a good DLC for us. But we're not going to do Souls-like. We're going to do another genre that has a name that is only makes sense if you played that, like if you played those games, and doesn't actually really truly describe what the kind of game is. And again, they cited in this discussion, I will say part of what lays the foundation for the discussion is keep in mind that first-person shooters, a genre that we are all widely familiar with in gaming, they didn't used to be called that. They used to be called Doom clones. And if you weren't a fan of Doom or had never played Doom, that wouldn't like speak to you as a good descriptor. So eventually the gaming community decided to land upon describing them as first-person shooters. So their argument was, we need to do the same thing with the Souls-like genre. Like if you're not a Souls fan, like we need a more accurate descriptor as to what this genre is. There's another game genre out there that's like that, and that's the one I wanted to talk about. They did also talk about it, and they came up with a name for this genre, but I will refrain from talking about that until the end. But we should rename the Metroidvania genre, because Metroidvania, again, though it's fun and it's a nice little shorthand for people who have played those franchises before, the influence of the Metroidvania game design has it's starting to outgrow that descriptor. So what do you think we should be calling Metroidvania games?
Well, of course, we have to start by picking apart what a Metroidvania game is.
Absolutely,
and kind of
100%.
Parts. So the Metroid section of that name is a little more complicated. I'll say that for last. So what about Castlevania? What is that? And to me, it's kind of a platforming game where you have like a weapon and there's enemies on the screen and you have to navigate platforming and combat at the same time. And so you're jumping across levels, you're kind of exploring, but it's more linear. And I would even put like ghouls and ghosts or ghosts and goblins into that category as well. And there's a million games, like Ninja Gaiden's kind of that, the original NES Ninja Gaiden games, and like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on the NES fits into that category. And what was that category called then? I would call it like an action platformer. So Mario would be a platformer, but because you don't have the sword melee combat weapons, throwing stars, etc. arsenal at your exposure. But even like Zelda 2 fits into that in Castlevania. Yeah. And I guess there's an upgrade system, like a character progression system, which is like RPG light. And so you have like things that will increase your max health bar, and you have gear that is a little bit better that maybe you can take an extra hit, your defense goes up, or you have some extra ammo for late end game items. So does that accurately depict Castlevania at least?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. So that's kind of action platforming. The Metroid side of that equation is the way you progress through the game. You find upgrades that open passageways to continue exploring. And the most representative modern example of that I can think of is like Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori and Blind Forest is a perfect example of a Metroid game. And of course, it started with Metroid on Nintendo, and it continues through the side-scrolling Metroid games, but it's also persisted in Metroid Prime, which went to first person. But the whole idea of it for defining what a game is the idea that you find an item and you have to kind of backtrack to go to a locked space that you now have the item to open. Mm-hmm. Even some of the top-down Zelda games of yesteryear explored in that regard too. You go back to the Kakariko village and like, oh, now I have this thing I can open up this area and get into. And
yeah, the idea is that the game teases you with things that like, oh, clearly I can get over there, but only if I were able to span this gap, and I don't have any tools that are able to, but there's a chest over there that I can obviously get and I want. But how, and sometimes it'll have some kind of visual indicator, like there's maybe a little target. And you're like, but how can I get there? What? And the intention is to get you to, like, later in the game, you get the hook shot or whatever it is, and like you see those targets again, you're like, oh, I can hook shot to those, so I should go back to that spot before and now I can use the hook shot or whatever it is, or bombs, or I'm trying to remember what it was. In Darksiders had a lot of this, and there was like very early in the game you'd encounter these giant ice chunks, and you're like, oh, that's clearly something, but I don't know how I'm supposed to get past it. I can't smash it with my sword, blah 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 blah. And then later you got like fists and you could punch them to break them or whatever. So it's like, okay, yeah. So that's, and to me, that's the big, to me, like more than the act, because you're right, we kind of have a name for the action platformers, which is action platformers. And if, you know, it may not necessarily be widely used, but if I were to describe a game as an action platformer, you'd probably have an idea as to what it was. So to me, the big thing that sets Metroidvania, what makes a game a Metroidvania game is that action. So if I were to like condense that to like a one or two word descriptor, I'd maybe call them like unlockers, where it's like you unlock things, more things as you go, like you get things to unlock things, or like unlock explorers or something like that would be maybe my first shot at it.
We need something like MMO, some sort of acronym that you don't really pronounce. So like locked progression action platformer. Ooh, or something like LPAP.
Yeah.
Or like maybe...
so the action platformer is then just the sort of suffix on that, because like because then you could have locked progression third person shooters or locked progression first person shoot. You know what I mean? Like you can, because we do that with genres anyways. We combine them together. So you could then take that locked progression. Yeah, I like that too, locked progression. So then you have LPF.
The ambiguity of locked progression kind of sucks, because what does that mean? Does that mean your character growth is locked? Or does that mean the environment's locked?
Well, then you could maybe say locked exploration, so LE.
Ooh, yeah. Locked exploration action platformer, or locked exploration first-person shooter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a locked exploration game.
I
it's
love
an
it.
open world locked exploration game. Done. Like it's a perfect descriptor.
Boom. You heard it first here. So their answer in Slightly Civil War was they call them sprawlers, which I think is cool. I like that name too, but it doesn't quite really like fit.
Yeah, it's too ambiguous. It's like open world. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a sprawling open world.
Yeah, an open world is arguably a sprawler as well.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Their answer, I did like their answer more for Souls-likes, and they had a couple, obviously, but the one I liked the most was to describe them as recursive. So like the big thing about like what makes a Souls-like, they argue what makes a Souls-like game is the fact that when you die, everything comes back. Like when you die, all the enemies respawn and you have to fight them all over again or whatever. And so they argued that a game like that is recursive. So then they made the same argument. So then Dark Souls is a recursive action RPG. Yep. And Code Vein would be a recursive JRPG. Stuff like that. I'm like, ooh, I like
great.
that. That's
good. I like that
that's
a lot.
Good one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. Awesome. Well, then that's DLC. We want to hear what your thoughts are. What should tackle either of those genres, Souls-likes or Metroidvania? What should we, as a gaming industry, begin to? How do we turn those Doom clones into first-person shooters? How do we rename those genres to be something more accurately descriptive, based on the elements that they have in common that make them definitively that genre? And Termite will tell you where you can do that.
You can interact with us the easiest way on social media, of course. So you can find our Facebook page, our Twitter, our Reddit, Instagram, all 80-Bit Podsmash. And you can find links to all of those social media platforms at 80bitpodsmash.com, where there are also links to our other podcast platforms. Whatever you want of your choice, You can find us there. The RSS feed link is there as well. You can throw that in. But finally, we have a Discord server as well. And the Discord server link is in all of our show notes. And finally, you can find us at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, where we go live every Monday and Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. Monday night with a news show, running you guys through the weekly news. And Wednesday evening with a gameplay live stream where Termite or Penguin will stream a game, talk about its pedigree, the developers, the things in it, the features, and run through some fun with you guys. You can interact with us in chat. Doesn't have to be that structured, but we have a good time. So we approach game streaming in that regard. Go check us out, twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash.
Awesome. All right, well, so that leads us into our main topic, which is we are talking about the Xbox 360 as part of our Soul in the Console series. So the one thing that, even though DLC isn't really a fixed part of this series, we do have a pretty fixed and rigid set of discussion topics that we go through. So we will start where we often like to start, which is the history of the Xbox 360. So let's put this thing into the context of our history.
So this I'm just going to read a little bit.
Sure.
Instead of just Wikipedia, I've been getting the inspiration for this entire series has actually come from a book that I have on my shelf. It's a hardback called The Game Console: A Photographic History from Atari to Xbox, and it's written by Evan Amos. And the synopsis are really small, really short. So I'll just read the Xbox 360. It came out in 2005 for the history. There you go. It is Microsoft's second console. But here's what he says. Microsoft pushed console gaming into a new era with the Xbox 360, a system whose HD graphics rivaled high-end PCs at the time of its release. Designed for the broadband age, the 360 focused heavily on online gaming and redefined the modern console with new features, such as a digital marketplace and in-game achievements. With a year's lead, a lower price, and generally better multi-platform game performance than the PlayStation 3, the 360 established Microsoft as a major contender that would go toe-to-toe with Sony. The console would sell more than 84 million units worldwide and become one of the best-selling systems of all time. So in 2005, this was the first next-gen console. The landscape, this is now me talking, I'm not reading anymore. The landscape was PlayStation 2, GameCube, and the original Xbox, and that's where the big three were headed. The PC gaming space was kind of exploding with broadband internet and MMORPG overhauls. We had World of Warcraft just the year prior, and so people were flocking to PC platforms and PC architectures. The 360 came out and said, hey, we're going to do 1080p for the first time. TVs could handle this. Like, TVs weren't even capable of 1080p. They were extremely expensive, the HD era.
Yeah, man, that's so crazy. Like, yeah. We lived through it, and now it's like, 1080p. My 1080p TV is sitting in my office because it's not as good as my 4K TV. But,
yep.
I mean, I remember when it was brand new. We didn't even, again, it wasn't even talked about as 1080p. It was always HD. It was all marketed as HD. Everything was HD, HD, HD.
Yep,
and this was that. Yeah, and this was that console.
Mm-hmm.
What do they technically call 4K now? Ultra HD? Is it UHD? Is that its
Yep.
that its moniker? Yeah. So that's still, that marketing's still around, but they've really leaned into the 4K. 4K is just so cool to say.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no. So the thing was conceived of in early 2003. They knew they were going to do a follow up to the original Xbox, and planning using the Xenon software platform began and was headed up by Jay Allard, Microsoft's vice president. In addition to that, Peter Moore, former president of Sega, joined Microsoft. So that was kind of a bit. I think we may have briefly touched on that with this with one of the Sega consoles. So this is the other side of that. Like, this guy left after all the stuff going down with Sega, and now he's coming over here to help, head up
Pop
development
quiz.
of.
Do you know where Peter Moore is now?
I don't.
He's at EA.
Is he at EA?
He's the talking head a lot for some of EA plays, and like
Nice.
he's a camera facing representative of EA.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to hear his. Like, sometimes I did Jeff Keighley Summer Game Fest with 2020 and coronavirus and all that stuff that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Moore was on some shows talking about how he was at some of these live events with the 360 back in the day as they were hyping up the Xbox One or the Xbox Series X. Peter Moore has no vested interest in Microsoft anymore because he's EA, but the fact that he was like reminiscing on the 360 made me fall into a nostalgic rabbit hole of watching like live E3 presentations. And sure enough, Peter Moore's there, like the stage figure. Yeah, he's an interesting person. I think he's pretty cool and fun to follow. So if you ever care at all about some of the figureheads in the gaming industry, he's one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the console then, like you said, would launch on November 22nd, 2005. And yeah, it gave Sony a run for their money. Though in the end, the PlayStation 3 would ultimately outsell the 360
Mm-hmm.
The 360 was one of the more celebrated consoles, at least in my circles of my generation. It was definitely made waves and was definitely the more desirable, at least again in my circles and just sort of in the buzz that it was around me. It was definitely more desirable than the PlayStation 3 at the time. And yeah, it was great. So cool. That's kind of the history. There's not really much else to say. There's no like juicy, fun stories like there were with some of the Sega consoles. It really was just the next iteration. They put it together and executed it without much drama or without much ado about nothing. Just, there was it looked like they did several different builds of it with various pieces of hardware before eventually landing on the Xenon processor by IBM. And then it launched and it was great.
Yeah, and the package includes the things that made the original Xbox stand out in that it was kind of close to a PC. It had a hard drive built in. It had a LAN port built in, like the original Xbox did. And those were unprecedented at the time for consoles. Like PlayStation 2 had a network adapter, and the GameCube had a network adapter, and the Dreamcast had a modem for 56. Well, it was not even 56K. It was the 28, whatever half of 56 is. So this continued that. It was the next iteration. So it has a bigger hard drive. It has a more PC-like architecture that is beefier than the original Xbox, and it continues to perform with broadband capabilities and have an online digital storefront and like track your account across like cloud saves eventually came, and like it allowed a lot of the modern console at the time. Consoles didn't have this stuff. PC games did, and so allowing the console to do it, this was the next logical step forward. That and they were the first one out of the gate with next gen. So in the HD era, Microsoft was first, and so boom, here you go.
And apparently they launched in 36 countries in a single year, and that's the most. At least I don't know if it's the most ever, but it was at the time it was the most countries launched in a single year, and than any other system, which is pretty crazy. Yeah. So they got it. I mean, just some. They got Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Russia, Japan, Europe, and United States and Canada. Like, boom, it's a lot. Like, there's more than that too. Those are just some of the those are the big ones. It's like, wow, yeah. That's again, Microsoft just killing it with the infrastructure, with the marketing and everything, and just with getting this thing out the gate. Like you said, they were the first out of the gate, and they started the 7th generation of video game consoles.
And it was a 4-year turnaround. The original Xbox had come out in 2001, and this came out in 2005, which is really fast.
And then this one would last. And then the irony of it being this one would almost last twice the duration. The console would last for the next pretty much 7 years, right? From 2005
that might not be necessarily a testament to the console itself, and more of a testament to the economic structure of the world in 2008.
Sure. Yeah. But it was still, I mean, it may have had an artificially extended lifespan, but the irony there is that after the quick turnaround of the Xbox, it would then be another 7 years before they get the Xbox One out of the gate.
Yep.
Which is just kind of interesting. But again, it was no complaining, right? Like it was a solid console that kept up to par with games for 7 years. So it's a good testament to it. So, all right, cool. So our next topic is we can talk a little bit, dig into the hardware. What was this box? What was the technology that made the Xbox 360?
You mentioned Xenon and IBM. So the CPU is a triple-core IBM Xenon processor that ran at 3.2 gigahertz, which was crazy fast. 3.2 gigahertz.
It's fun to like. We started this series talking about the Sega Genesis, which was running at was it megahertz? I think it was running at megahertz, and we were like laughing at, oh my gosh, how slow that is by today's standards. But it's just funny because we go from megahertz to gigahertz to terahertz. We're not even at terahertz yet, so we're still in the gigahertz range. So that's pretty awesome. That's pretty good for a 15-year-old console.
Yeah, and there was a Pentium 4 that had just come out in 2003. That was running at 3.4 gigahertz. So, and that's, Intel Pentium. That's desktop processors. And that's kind of the mainstream. There was a more extreme version that ran a little faster. But just the fact that this is at 3.2 gigahertz and it's 3 cores. Desktop PCs were doing multi-core. They were experimenting with it too. But, I mean, this is a beast. This is where Xbox really matched PC gaming for the first time for a small portion. I mean, we closed every console generation has closed the gap between consoles and PCs, but this was a massive leap forward. So it was a crazy good processor. It also had a Xenos, so Xenon CPU, and a Xenos GPU made by ATI that ran at 500 megahertz. And I don't know what the equivalent graphics processor would be at the time, but I am going to try and do a quick Google as I talk and see what 2005 AMD looks like. Radeon 1800, which at the time I guess could run things like Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 and those kind of games at 60 frames per second, 1080p resolutions. So the fact that this console could also kind of do, I know a lot of the games weren't native 1080 at the launch, but it was pretty good. And the original Xbox, just 4 years prior, had an NVIDIA X GPU that ran at 233 megahertz. So this is more than twice as fast on the video card. We also have 512 megabytes of RAM, which is like at the time a
respectable
computer
at the time, but not by today's standards. RAM is where we've really started to just pile on in the PC and console space, for that matter.
And that's up from 64 megabytes 4 years prior. Yeah. So 512 is a huge upgrade, and that's pretty much the hardware. It had a hard drive in it of 20 gigs. And that was a $400 model, and then there was a $300 model with no hard drive. Yeah, 20 gigs for like game saves was huge. Remember, we didn't have we didn't have a digital storefront prior to like the Xbox starting it. So when you see on the box 20 gigs, you're like, oh my gosh, I can store.
It's just so crazy how bloated games have gotten now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Being 20 gigs now is the size of like a 5-hour game. You know what I mean? Like a 5-hour single player game, which is like as low assets as you can get. And we're happy when we see 20 gigs on a game now, and that's your entire hard drive for the 360. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
But that was it. So it was a comparable to PC hardware. You know, it could run. It was in a box. It was cheap. You could buy games for it, and it worked. And it was.
Now they had HDMI for the HDMI
later
was
models.
the out. But for the later models, they didn't have it for the... Okay.
Right. The launch model had the component cables, the green, red, and blue three-pronged approach.
Yeah,
the HDMI cable was there, and I think the later hardware revisions included it. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Well, because they mentioned HDMI in the sound portion here, where they list the sound. So I was like, was this the first console that used HDMI? Because HDMI is, again, it's still the output format these days, which is pretty cool. So... awesome. Yeah, I mean, this really was the console. This was the start of what we see now with consoles, quite frankly, from just a pure sheer hardware perspective. And this Xbox really kind of was the package deal of what consoles would be going forward for the most part for the last like 3 generations. So cool. Then after hardware, we talk about the controller. So let's talk about the controller and describe it and talk about our opinions on the innovations or lack thereof with the 360's controller.
Sure. The controller is the foundation for what we see today, kind of replicated. Every controller today is modeled after the 360 controller. It was
Pretty
that
much.
good.
Yep.
It was widely accepted, and it's arguably the best video game controller ever made. In fact, I think Andrea Renee said it recently from What's Good Games that when asked what her favorite controller of all time was, even after the newest gen, was still the 360 controller because it felt so perfect and so good. It was weighted so well, and the buttons felt so good. Everything was accessible. It had an offset joysticks with a D-pad, and it was way better in your hand than the original Xbox's controller. The button layout. This took from the DualShock 1 and 2, where it has now 4 shoulder buttons, because the original Xbox did not. It only had 2 triggers. So this now has what we call the bumpers, RB and left B, and then the triggers as well. And then that Xbox button in the middle was game-changing. That was the first console to have like a home, let's take you out of the game and have an operating system that exists kind of perpetually in the background. So you could always jump back to look at your friends list or see your achievements. And so it had that Xbox button that always brought you back to like the main screen with the blades on it. And that was revolutionary. And so now today you can see the DualShock 3 had a PlayStation button, and the DualShock 4 and the DualSense and the Xbox One controllers, and the Switch now even has a home button on the Nintendo Switch. The Wii had a home button. So
after playing my PlayStation for so long, I can now I never know which side. I always end up accidentally taking a screenshot when I get on my Pro controller. I'm like,
Yep, same here. Yeah, it's offset just enough to throw. Yeah, Nintendo is backwards because their A and B is switched as well.
Yeah.
Like,
no.
Least
Xbox is backwards. Their A and B and X and Y are switched. Like they literally have the flip. flip-flop
I
on
say
it.
Nintendo is backwards is because the X and O of PlayStation matches Microsoft's A and B position, making Nintendo's confirm and reject buttons backwards.
I gotcha.
Compared to the other ones.
Yeah, that's
I'm
fair.
thinking more abstractly than what A and B actually are. But you are correct. Nintendo started B and A in the position that they are, and Xbox switched it. But the industry moved forward in one direction, and Nintendo stayed. And so, like, now every time I play the Switch, I'm like accidentally backing out of menus trying to
the problem.
I mean, dang it.
The problem with the success, they didn't make themselves victims of their own success, but they made all of us victims of their success, which is because this controller was so like universally like, okay, this is the template for controllers going forward. All the different manufacturers then, like we're talking about, decided to make their own spin on it, while it still feels and more or less is the same layout, with slight variations, as we've been discussing, to the point where, and we've talked about this on the podcast at length, which is, depending on what platform you're playing on, X may be in a completely different spot. And the PlayStation controllers aren't exempt from this either, to the point where that is the sole reason why I still think the GameCube is the single greatest controller ever designed, because of the fact that the buttons themselves have a tactile difference to them. So you know which one is B because it's the smaller one. You know which one is A because it's the big round one. X and Y are differently shaped as well. So you can kind of figure it out based on touch alone, as opposed to having to look down at the controller. Am I hitting? Is that which one's box and which one's circle? Which one's X and Y on this controller versus X and Y? But it was because of the 360 that kind of that template began to solidify. But again, that's a testament to their success. That's not knocking the console controller. It is a testament to that controller's success. So
the biggest thing about the controller that should not go untalked about is the fact that it was wireless out of the box. It had complete wireless connectivity with no latency whatsoever. It was not a third-party option. It was baked in, first party. You got a wireless controller, and that was unheard of. First time for a console. It had a sync button on it. You could synchronize the buttons, and the little unique solution to how you know if you're player 1, 2, 3, or 4 by lighting up a quadrant of the Xbox ring on the controller was amazing. It just felt good. You could see it. It was obvious. It made sense, and it was so intuitive. And it had a battery pack that had AA batteries, or you could buy a rechargeable battery pack for it and plug it in to charge up. And so, I mean, that started this. We have that today. Like, Xbox has not changed that. The Series X,
to its detriment. I would argue the battery having to stick batteries in it when it runs out of batteries is probably.
I mean, it does seem backwards for an Xbox Series
for
X
now, but
batteries.
at the time that was perfect.
Right.
Yeah,
So at the time, this was like amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to do the same thing with the Wavebirds on the GameCube. So I will also say, as a controller innovation that was noticeable to me, I don't know when the wired controllers did come out, but when they did come out, they were USB, which is huge because it meant that you could slap that thing into your PC and use your comfortable Xbox controller to PC game as well if you had multiple platforms you're playing on. So that was
Steam adapted that and like changed the UI to like accommodate the controller that it detected. So I didn't realize that was a thing until way later. I fired up BioShock or something Infinite on Steam, and I plugged in my Xbox 360 controller, and I noticed all of the prompts went from like spacebar to confirm or whatever to A. And I was like, what? That's crazy. I didn't even realize games did that. And they did.
Yep. It was really cool. Cool. All right. So let's very briefly, because I know you want to get to this the last section, but let's briefly talk about kind of what were some of the games that were definitive for this generation, because the reality is there's so much that came out in this generation, and so many third-party titles really shined on the 360, whereas Sony at the time was pushing a less than stellar run of first-party titles.
Initially,
Xbox was just singing. Yeah, initially, Xbox was just singing on their third-party titles and really making a name for themselves as the best place to play these games. So, yeah, what were some of the ones though that really defined the Xbox?
That was a good tee up. So generally, when we talk about the definitive games of a console, we want to talk about the exclusives for a console. But this is a exception to that rule, and that is this was the console to play third-party games on, like you said. And there's a couple of reasons why, and it was that online infrastructure and the ease of accessibility with party chat and collecting your friends to play a game with friends lists and achievement tracking. They had it all. Sony had none of that. They had no trophies. Their storefront was a web app, and the party system was horrible. It did not come with a headset for the controller, and so you had to find these USB headsets that were compatible. It was expensive. It was obtuse. And so if you did get Call of Duty on the PlayStation, it was way more difficult. There are a lot of barriers of entry to play with your friends than if you just bought it on 360. Plus, the performance of the 360 initially was also better for third-party games. So the Xbox 360, I have to say, definitive games, let's just put third-party as a definitive game. And I'm talking like all of Madden and FIFA and Call of Duty and all those games that are just like Grand Theft Auto, were so much better at the time of the launch of 360 before Sony had a chance to catch up because of those things. So that's the first definitive game, third party. Then we have the exclusives. And if you've ever heard of Gears of War, the first one ever created was on the 360. So that's probably the biggest first party new franchise coming off of the 360 that I would say would define what the 360 is. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was running on Unreal 3 and it had co-op, split screen co-op, online co-op. It defined what the next Halos would look like because Halo 2 was co-op too locally, but also Halo 3 Reach and Halo 4 all had online parties, 4-player co-op, plus all of the multiplayer. And it started with Gears of War utilizing the tech that was in this console to show it all off and make it appealing and compelling to play with a great story, voice acting, mocap. I mean, it hit all of the AAA buttons that you would want to see in an HD game and really shined. I don't even think it was a launch game. I think it came out later.
It did, yeah.
Man, Gears of War is just an absolutely amazing franchise coming off of the 360. And then we had a spin-off of racing games, the Forza series that started on the original Xbox. There was a Forza Horizon, which was a more arcade spin on the racing sim. Came out on 360, and that has continued today. There's Forza Horizon 4 on the Xbox Series consoles. And then there was a fun little series from Capcom called Dead Rising. I don't know if you ever played this, but it's about a photographer.
I thought you were going to be like, there's a fun little series that you might not have ever heard of before called Halo.
Oh, no. I talked about Halo 3 Reach and 4 already. So
gotcha. Yeah, I see.
I mean, Halo's obvious, right? Microsoft and Halo are just like, it's a thing, it's Bungie, but they switched to 345 Studios for Halo 4. I mean, that happened during the 360 era, but it's Halo. Like, it's all good, it's all amazing. I don't have to really wax eloquently
of course
about Halo.
I just thought it was really funny because that was the next one I saw on your list. Yeah. And like Dead Rising, but I was like, that would have been a fun way to tee up Halo there. No, I've heard of Dead Rising. Yeah.
It's everywhere now. It's like multi-platform and stuff, but at the time it was an Xbox exclusive, and it was a fun new spin, new genre. It was like a photographer in a mall that was like overrun with zombies, and it was very difficult. It was super hard.
Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 were smack dab in the middle of America's zombie craze. There were zombie games, zombie comics, zombie shows, zombie movies, zombies, Pride and Prejudice and zombies. Like there was zombies just everywhere. And so, there were just tons of zombie games that came out on the 360. And there were zombie modes that were added to Halo and Call of Duty and all that stuff. So not surprising to see a zombie franchise on there. And then, of course, yes, the last on your list, though, I will talk about is Fable. Yeah. Fables 2 and 3 in particular. Fable 1 came out on the Xbox, but 2 and the follow-ups, the arguably better follow-ups came up on the 360. So, cool. Well, then, let's really quickly talk about attachments and innovative accessories. The big one was the Kinect.
Yes.
Competing with the Wii and the motion controls. So the Wii kind of beat everyone else to the market with motion controls and motion capture. And so Xbox tried to compete with them by saying the Kinect sensor, you don't even need to hold anything in your hands. It'll just detect your movements. And it's always watching you. Please ignore that fact.
Right. But and, I played Dance Central so much, and Ryan, friend of the show, our groups got together and played the crap out of some Dance Central. It was amazing. It sold me on a Kinect. Kinect Adventures was like a co-op game where you could like write white water raft and like do all these different mini games, jumping over boxes and stuff and it worked really well. The problem was there was no really good long longevity with it. Like the experimental titles weren't enough to keep it going, so it quickly died off. And like it had some great experiences in that space, but it was unique because you didn't have to have a controller. It was just a camera that watched your video or watched your whole body. Yep.
The other kind of accessory, but technical, more of it was built in the console, but it had HD DVD player included in there, which is a word.
It was not included.
Oh, wasn't
it? It was a box. Yeah, it was a $200 box. $200. It was a side box. It's called the Xbox 360 HD DVD drive.
But you could play regular DVDs in it natively,
I think
right?
so, yeah.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
I was going to say, I know that I could pop movies in there, but
that
was the big thing. I remember when people were like, consoles can play DVDs too. That's crazy. Let's watch so many movies. And like the irony is now we're in a post DVD world, like we're in a post physical format where we're in the streaming world right now, which is just completely, I wouldn't say negated that kind of form of entertainment, but I remember being like, let's watch our favorite movies on our consoles.
You are showing your age, sir, because I did that in 2001 with the PlayStation 2. That was my DVD player.
Well, we did that too.
3 years.
I
4
remember
years
that.
prior to this.
I remember that too. No, I'm
that
with
was
you.
the big, like, oh my gosh, I can rent DVDs now. This is amazing.
Yeah. No, for sure. I definitely felt like the PlayStation 2 was a part of that, but I didn't own a PlayStation 2, so I would do that at my friend's house for sure, and I still had that whole experience. But when I did own a 360, and I was like, okay, here's my DVD player from now on.
So if you do rewind the clock at the HD era, there were 2 formats for watching HD
see, that's what I was gonna say. Like that's a term I haven't heard in an age. HD DVD, because it was Blu-ray.
Yeah. Yep. So HD DVD versus Blu-ray, and like they were both on the shelf. If you walked into at the time a Blockbuster or a used movie store, you could find either. Like you could see Lord of the Rings on all these different platforms or something. I don't Matrix, whatever. But Sony had the Blu-ray because they owned that format, and Xbox tried with the HD DVD and they lost. So the HD DVD format died. The drives still exist and the movies are still out there. So if you have them, it'll be as vintage as a Laserdisc player or a Betamax player. They're there, but it's kind of a neat little innovation. Like, let's add this whole HD thing, this 1080p TV. Let's wrap that whole living room idea that failed so miserably on the Xbox One later in their life. They started that here with the HD DVD drive.
Yep. It continued to have some of the same accessories and attachments that you'd find on the Xbox. You know, the headset that attached to the controller and all that stuff. You'd also
a memory card too.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then, but they also, the last one I wanted to quickly throw in there was the 360 chat pad.
Yeah.
Where it was a little keyboard that you could attach to your controller and then type out messages. That was when, again, it was the early days of internet gaming, right? So people still felt like they needed to be able to chat. Because like on PC gaming, you could chat messages to each other. So people still felt like they needed that. And so Xbox tried to answer that with the chat pad. Didn't take off, wasn't popular. Eventually they would just, that's why we don't see it today. Eventually they would just move on to making everything just voice only, which is where we're at pretty much now.
Or on-screen keyboard.
Right.
You can do,
Exactly. Cool. All right. I know you want to talk about impact and legacy, so that's where we'll end. What is the impact and legacy of the Xbox 360? What did it bring? How did it bring gaming forward, and why is it influential in game design all the way up through today?
The impetus of all of this is the broadband era.
Yeah.
Being able to evolve from the limited capacity of 56K dial-up and switch over to a much faster bandwidth that did not take up a phone line. And this, because Microsoft decided to go all in on broadband with an actual feature set that needed it and leveraged it, we have today, any feature we see today can be traced completely back to the launch of a 360, starting with, and some of it even back farther to the original Xbox, because they really pioneered stuff then. But this was like the defining age. The fact that we're talking about 4K 120 frames per second, and that's printed on the box of my new console, is because of the Xbox 360 going all in on HD era, like actually focusing on resolution. Because in the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox era, no one cared if it was 280, 480. Like, no one paid any attention to resolutions or what those were. When they bought TVs, it didn't really matter. It was just, you buy a TV based on some picture quality settings and stuff and some metrics at the time. But this was like HD. And now we're seeing it today with 4K and Ultra HD. It can all be traced back to the 360 because it was first out of the gate. So like Sony did some of this stuff with the PlayStation 3, but it was a year behind. So that's why I say that Microsoft is really pioneering this stuff. With the broadband age, met this idea of a single sign-in, like single sign-on account, where you have your Microsoft account. And at the time, I think it was MSN or Hotmail. It was the same email address. It was like kind of what the grandfather to our Gmail account is today. Like everything is just, you sign in with your Microsoft account and you have your gamer score and your gamer tag and you have your achievements. And achievements were brand new right out of the box with the 360. For the first time ever, you could do these little in-game like things and you would get an achievement for it and a score, and it would continuously accumulate this score over the forever to today. Like fast forward 20 years, or I don't even know, 14 years later, my gamer score is the same gamer score cumulative as it was when this console came out. Like, it has been building ever since, because I've tied my account, because of that single sign-on cloud-based account that has persisted ever since. Yeah, so you have achievements, internet continues to, the broadband allows for a digital marketplace. Finally, Xbox started the live arcade, allowing indie games to take fruition in the console market. Like, it's not just PC space anymore. And we have games like Braid and Limbo and Super Meat Boy and Castle Crashers and many, many more that have come out. And the digital marketplace idea started on the 360. The fact that we can go buy every new game on day one digitally can be traced back to the console of 360. Like, it's awesome. Like, that's the idea of DLC becoming a business model to make money and to like complement the development costs that are ballooning and becoming crazy on AAA titles. You can even trace the negative aspects of that with the microtransactions and the exploitations therein all the way back to the 360, because it's connected to the internet and you can do these small little exchanges. They experimented with like your Microsoft credits, and it wasn't a 1-to-1 ratio with dollars. It was like $5 would get you 50 credits, but then like $10 would get you 110 credits or something like that. And then you would buy things on the Microsoft store with the console with your credits. And you can go to the physical stores and buy cards that stacked your credit count. So all of that was impacted and legacy. Like, that is today. Our entire existence in PS5 and Xbox Series X and S is traced back to the 360. It is probably the most monumental change in console gaming we have seen in our lifetime.
I was gonna say, I can't think of. I feel like the Xbox 360 was the last big step forward that we've seen in our lifetime in regards to like the Xbox One, the PS4, and even the PS5 and the Xbox Series X are just steps forward in numbers, but they haven't really innovated the consoles forward since. We have yet to see the next big jump forward. It's just been, it's faster, it's more powerful, but it's the same kind of deal with the console. And the Xbox 360, I feel like, was the last of those. Where it was a game changer in regards to what the thing was capable of from just a simple user experience level. And it really is. I mean, it was the first what I would describe as modern console. And though it is soon to gain retro status in the next few years by the definition of retro, I will have a very, very hard time accepting that console as a retro console. And for the exact reasons that you're talking about, which is like, again, it was the first console to really truly push a PC mindset in regards to, you've got to have the specs, you got to have the HD, and it was the first one to, like you said, really. Well, the Xbox was the first one to do it, but the Xbox 360 was the one to solidify this idea of like, you are logging into this console and it is your go-to space for entertainment. And so that's, I mean, again, that mentality is still around today. You know, maybe not fully. Some of the whole idea of like the one single device kind of died out with the Xbox One, but still, it's still that idea of just like having, you know, you're signing in, you're getting into your system, and all of your cool stats are there, and all of your favorite apps are there, and the settings are the way you like it. Like, in the same way that you have that with the PC, you have that with the Xbox 360. And though they pioneered that with the Xbox, it really started to take shape and be definitive with the 360. So yeah, I would agree. This is the modern console, and this is the first time it really kind of took shape in our minds. And at the time, it was all cool and new, and we didn't know that we would never really get a change from it. And obviously, there have been iterations and innovations still, as we will. You know, again, we're not going to end the series there. Like, we're still going to talk about the Xbox One and what it brought to the table, and we'll talk about the PS4 and the PS5 and the Series X eventually, probably. Yep. But in the meantime, like, this was kind of the beginning of the modern era of gaming with this console.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, cool. All right. Well,
and the last thing, you talked about how there's no drama, or not a whole lot of drama with this. It's just another console. That was how it was at launch until several years, maybe 2 years after launch. 68 of every 100 units were found to be defective. Over 2/3 of every Xbox 360 succumbed to what is now known as the Red Ring of Death.
And legendary.
Legendary failure. In fact, I recently found a used console that had one, and I took and made a GIF of it, and I posted it all over our social media because I was excited to have one. I'd never seen it firsthand because I came to the Xbox 360 space late, so I never had a launch console, so I never experienced Red Ring of Death. I had one of the hardware revised versions that they had fixed it. But 68 of every 100 units were a failure. And it was due to a change that they could do the solder lead free. And somehow the heat coming off the GPU was drying out some of that solder, and it wasn't the normal stuff they'd used. They had to meet European standards. And I'm actually kind of reading through a quote from Peter Moore, actually. And so they spent a ridiculous amount of money to resolve this. I would love to know what the figure is. But here on Wikipedia, there's a $240 million that went to FedEx just to deal with shipping customers empty boxes and shipping labels and like shipping them replacement consoles and paying for all of that. I can't imagine how much this cost.
Yeah.
It was an astronomical amount of money to try and recoup
correct this issue. Yeah. Yeah. No, the Red Ring of Death was legendary.
Microsoft being Windows and Microsoft Office. Oh, actually, here it is. Peter Moore recounts $1.15 billion in Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death, like in that whole saga. That's from Eurogamer in July 2015. It was when that article was posted, so you can check it out.
A lot of money. Yep. Well, that certainly offset their profits for sure. But
yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah, you're right. We can't talk about the 360 without talking about the Red Ring of Death. And those kinds of hardware defects are like the reason why today we still talk about how like you're rolling the dice when you get a new console right off the manufacturing line. Like we talked about that with our PS5s, and I had the orange screen of death on my Switch recently. Like, and I talked about that on the podcast. Haven't seen it since, fortunately. Thank God. Cross my fingers. But yeah, it is the when you buy the first line of consoles, and in Xbox's case, it sounded like it was several lines, several iterations of the console. You really are opening yourself up to, their first. Again, they haven't had a year to test this thing necessarily. You know what I mean? So those kinds of so you see it with the DualSense drift and the Joy-Con drift for some of the more benign iterations of that. But it's the same idea of like these things. These machines are getting more and more complicated. It's not as simple as it was back in the day when it was just a chipset connected to, connected to a couple of pieces of hardware and an output device. Like they're getting more and more complicated with more and more moving parts with smaller and smaller precision engineered pieces of equipment. And those things break down and have unexpected issues. So the Red Ring of Death was kind of brought us into that age as well.
And it's worth noting this as a legacy because every console manufacturer ever since has taken steps to stop this from ever happening again, and on both the hardware front and the customer service warranty aspect. Like almost every big company now, like T-Bone had a PlayStation 5 failure, and they had a new unit to him in 10 days. It's crazy fast. Like from the day he called to the day he received a replacement PS5 was 10 days, and it cost him nothing. And that is a testament to the failure of Microsoft. So analogous to CD Projekt Red's failure with Cyberpunk, it's those big flops. It's those big, extremely expensive, horrible mistakes that companies will all learn from and never do again. And you have a metric to point to, $1.12 billion of loss because of this hardware oversight. It'll never happen again. Cooling systems will always be better. The solder will always be checked. Quality control will always have a certain
something will happen. You know what I mean? Like there's always something that can go wrong. But this particular issue, is
and the redundancy here is the warranty service. So like you talked about more precise consoles and more advanced things. And so the companies themselves have invested in an insurance policies with these things with bigger warranties and easier to replace units and being more understanding about things and like faster returns. Even the retailers, it's so easy to return and exchange consoles for another one now. It's not a big deal. And so because of the Xbox 360's colossal failure in that regard. Yep. So anyway,
cool. All right, well, we're out of time. That's the show. So those are some of the more impactful parts of the Xbox 360. So we want to hear what your thoughts are on the 360. Did you love the console? Did you hate it? Were you a cool PC gamer at the time when it came out, like I was, and only got it
that whole
later?
Generation.
I got it. I got the 360. I got a little windfall of cash at one point. It's a whole different story. And I was like, I'm going to buy a 360 because I'm a cool gamer that gets modern consoles. And then I use it for a DVD player. What are your thoughts on the 360? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you have one? And what were your experiences with it? And Termite will tell you all about where you can share those thoughts and more with us.
I would love to start a Reddit thread on this. So you should go to reddit.com/r/8bitpodsmash and talk on that as a community. That would be fantastic. You could also go to our Discord server, and the link to that is in all of our show notes. And then any other information you would like from us is at 80bitpodsmash.com. Make sure that you are subscribing and liking to our social medias because you will be up to date with what we're doing. When I decide to stream specific stuff, when Penguin jumps on and wants to do something crazy, you'll be made aware of it. You'll be able to follow our comings and goings, and you'll be able to jump on to our live streams over at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash and join in on the community and have fun, interact, and ask us questions and feedback.
All right, great. So next week we are going to do an episode. It is April Fool's week. We're not going to do an April Fool's episode because it's a weirdly timed one. It'll be March 29th, so a little too soon, but the next one's a little too after, so April Fool's lands at a weird spot. But we will be talking about gaming communities, so we'll talk about some of what are the kind of major communities that contribute to what we call gaming culture. So it'll be more of a culture-based episode than an industry-based episode, but we'll be talking a high-level view on various gaming communities that have sort of influenced us over time and been kind of influential to the culture. So that is what you have to look forward to next week, and we'll see you then.
See you next week.